This presentation is going to be dealing with beneficial plantings for pollinators, primarily in the North Carolina Piedmont region. My name is Jim Burke. I'm a volunteer with Keep Gastonia Beautiful. I'm also a member of the Gaston County Beekeepers Association and just recently retired from the North Carolina Cooperative Extension as the Gaston County Natural Resources Agent. We're celebrating the city of Gastonia's Bee City designation with our second annual BEEtopia event. That was planned for this June. Unfortunately, due to the coronavirus, it wasn't a good idea to get hundreds of people together in a small area. So we're going to provide our presentations on this platform for people to access and still get the information without getting potentially exposed to the virus. This presentation is going to provide information on beneficial plantings to support pollinators in the Piedmont region of North Carolina. However, almost all of the principles that we're going to discuss would apply anywhere in the United States in terms of establishing a garden or habitat. The only difference is flowers that you might plant would potentially be different if you're in a different area. At the end of this presentation, we've got extensive references, and there are several groups that provide information on plants that will do well in various regions throughout the United States, so you'll be able to access that information. In addition to providing the pollinator garden to provide pollen and nectar sources for pollinators, you can go a step further and provide things like host plants, water, and shelter so that you actually create a sustainable habitat for pollinators. So that's something you can shoot for. Look at it in the planning stages, and like I said, it's not that much more work, and you can go a step further and provide that habitat as well. Before you plant, so these are things that you need to do before you run out, buy all your plants and stick them in the ground. So before you plant, you need to do some research. How much available space do you have for planting or establishing your habitat? One of the questions that we get at our Beekeepers Association, new beekeepers say, I want to plant flowers in my yard so that I can provide all the flowers that my hive is going to need and they won't need to leave my yard. Well, unfortunately, bees visit a lot of flowers in order to produce that honey. For example, bees visit about 2 million flowers to obtain enough nectar to produce just 1 pound of honey. And when you think about looking at a beehive, a super, which is the box that contains the frames where the bees deposit their honey or create their honey, one small super, when it's filled with honey, weighs 50 pounds. So bees are visiting 100 million flowers to produce that 50 pounds of honey. So unless you've got a lot of property, you're not realistically going to be able to plant enough flowers to provide everything you need, your bees need to make that honey. So even if you only have a small area though, planting something is providing food and resources to those pollinators. The next thing you want to check is, once you've got your area that you want to plant, how much sunlight does that area receive? That's really important to know because different plants have different requirements in terms of sunlight. Some do well in shade, some do well in partial sunlight. Others may need 5 to 6 hours of full sun a day. So it's important that you know that when you go to pick your flowers, you know exactly what degree of sunlight you can provide in your given area. The next thing you want to check is, or decide, is what types of pollinators do you want to attract to your garden. Some plants are very specific food sources for one type of pollinator. Other plants may provide a food resource to a variety of pollinators. Some plants that are out there actually serve as host plants. These are plants where the insects lay their eggs. After the eggs hatch, the larvae feed on that plant. So it's just providing a place for those insects to reproduce. So you need to take a look at that and see, what are you really shooting for? Most people are going to want to service multiple types of pollinators. The next thing you want to do once you've figured out where you're going to plant and how much sunlight you have, is you want to perform soil testing on that area where you're going to plant. This is critical for determining if your soil has suitable properties to support the plants that you're going to put there. So things like proper pH and suitable nutrient concentrations are essential for you to know, so that you know if you're going to be successful planting those particular plants in that particular spot in your yard or on your property. The North Carolina Cooperative Extension can provide you with soil test forms and sample boxes for you to take your samples and mail them in to the North Carolina Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services for analysis. Okay, these are some recommendations dealing with plants, the specific plants. I'm not gonna read off just a list of plants for you, because that would cause you to run screaming from the room, but we're going to talk about general requirements on this. So basic requirements for planting. What you want to do for a pollinator garden is you want to aim for a succession of blooms that span the entire growing season. You don't want to just have blooms for spring or just for summer, because the pollinators need food throughout the growing season. So ideally you want to plant plants that are going to bloom at different times, so that there's always something in bloom for the pollinators to take advantage of. And you want to use several species that bloom at any given time, because you want to have some variety as well. You're going to combine annuals and perennials in your garden, and we'll talk a little bit about that later on. And you don't want to use any pesticides, obviously, in your garden. A word about hybridized ornamentals. This is something that you need to be aware of when you're planting your garden and what you're going to plant. Many commercially grown ornamentals actually have little or no pollen or nectar value for pollinators. And the reason behind that is because many plant varieties now are bred for particular traits. For example, double flowering. That makes the plant more desirable to some consumers, but it usually comes at the expense of something else. So if you breed for this particular trait, you usually lose something else in the process. And one of those traits that you can lose is pollen and nectar. So for example, hybrid pansies, they might look very attractive, but they may have little or no pollen or nectar for pollinators. So it doesn't mean you shouldn't plant them, but plant them somewhere else other than your pollinator garden, because you're wasting space there, because those plants aren't going to provide any food to your pollinators. Color is an essential element in your garden. Pollinators are attracted to blooms initially by color, and some pollinator groups have preferences. So flies, which are one of the groups of pollinators, they prefer white and yellow blooms. Bees prefer blues and purples, and by the way, bees cannot see the color red, just for your information. Beetles and butterflies and diurnal moths, those are moths that you see during the day, they pretty much visit anything, so they don't seem to have a particular preference. And then if you have flowers that bloom at night, nocturnal moths, those are the moths that come out at night, they seem to be attracted initially by the scent given off by the flower. But nighttime blooming plants usually have flowers that are white, cream colored, or pale green. Natives versus exotic versus invasives. So this is not a commercial for native plants only. You don't have to run out and rip out all your exotic plants or non-native plants. But keep in mind that native pollinators have evolved along with native flowers. So they're going to do best if you have native plants available for them to visit. Again, doesn't mean that they won't visit non-native plants, but in general, they're going to do better with native species. However, if you have invasive plants, do go home and rip all those out, because they do very little in general for most pollinators. Because remember, those are plants that have been brought in recently from outside the country. Our pollinators have not had any experience with them, so oftentimes they serve no purpose in terms of providing pollen and nectar, and they also force out our native plants. So they're not a good thing to have. If you don't have any currently in your yard, don't plant any. So a couple more questions. Do I use plants or do I use seeds? And what about annuals versus perennials? So there's some economical and ecological considerations when you look at these questions. From an economic standpoint, seed is going to be cheaper than purchasing established plants, especially if you're going to plant a large area. Another option or another benefit of seeds is for uncommon plants, there may not be any nurseries that are growing those and selling them as established plants, so seed might be your only option if you're interested in growing a particular plant that is good for your area but maybe is not one of the more popular plants in the nursery industry, so plants aren't available for that particular species. On the plus side for plants, established plants, they have a better chance of first-year survival. So if you're growing plants from seed, their chances of survival are not as good as an established plant. So that's a decision you have to make. Plus, it also, like I said, gets back to economics. How much money do you have to spend? And if you've bought established plants recently from a nursery or garden center, you know that they can get pretty expensive. So if you're looking at a large area and you decide you want to use all plants, that's going to be pretty expensive. The annuals versus perennials question, you should really plant both, and this is why. Annuals, assuming they are in good soil and they get all their requirements, they're going to bloom during the current year. So you'll have flowers available this year, for example. The perennials, they may bloom the first year, or for some perennials it may take 2 or even 3 years before they produce blooms. So yes, down the road you'll have blooms, but right now you don't have anything if you plant these perennials. So having some annuals in there provides a kind of a jump start for your garden, with the understanding that, you know, next year or the year after my perennials are going to start coming on, and once they do, then they'll be on every year. So how much should I plant? Well, again, depends on the area you have available. It depends on your budget, how much you have to spend. Again, like I talked on the previous slide, seeds are cheaper than established plants. Plus the area that you're planting is going to govern how much you need to plant, so you need to look at that in terms of your budget. Another thing that people don't often consider is the size of the mature plant that you intend to plant. So you're going to have a mixture of plants, most likely. Depending on how big that plant is going to get when it becomes mature is also a factor in how much you're going to plant. So Joe Pye weed is a good example. It's an excellent pollinator plant, but when it's mature it can be anywhere from 6 to 8 feet tall and 2 to 3 feet wide. So if you've got a small area, you don't want to plant a bunch of Joe Pye weed or you won't have room for anything else. You have to take the size of the plant when it's mature into consideration when you're making your selection based on how big of an area you have to plant. Also depends on how much time you have to maintain your garden. If you're a gardener and you really like being out in the garden and maintaining it and working on it on a regular basis, that's one thing. If you just want to plant something and pretty much, you know, leave it alone other than watering it, maybe doing a little weeding, then that's going to also determine how much you want to plant. If you have questions about these, like I said, we have resources at the end of the slides, but you can also contact local nurseries and your cooperative extension. They can help you with figuring out those questions and determining how much you should plant for your garden. Planting patterns and when to plant. So when you're looking at how you're going to put your plants out in your garden, ideally you want to plant flowers to form blocks of color rather than just scattering them out at random. I mean, we've all seen wildflower gardens that are just a random collection of a bunch of flowers, and they look very nice, but the pollinators, when they come to visit a flower source, it's best for them, it's most efficient for them to be able to work on that particular species all in one area, so they don't waste time going from this species flower located here and then 10 yards away to that same flower again, and going around the garden that way. It's much better for them to be able to focus in one area. And you want to create blocks using a single species. When you're planting color blocks, if you're using any kind of hybrid, make sure that you're aware that hybrids the pack of seeds for that hybrid may result in a variety of colors. So you need to take that into consideration, especially if you're looking for blocks of color. If you plant some seeds, you may not get all blue flowers. You may get blue, red, yellow, white. So take that into consideration when you're planting. And then as far as when to plant, you need to plant according to the needs of the plant. So if you're looking at seeds or established plants, on the seed packet, it'll tell you when to plant the seeds. For established plants, that you can get that information from your garden center or your nursery, wherever you're purchasing the plant. So again, it takes a little bit of pre-planning to figure out, okay, these are the plants I want to plant, when do I need to plant them, and that kind of drives how you set up your garden. So the things you want to look at in terms of maintaining your garden, of course, the two main things are going to be watering and weeding. Watering, if you're using native plants, this is another area where native plants come in handy. Understand that they are better adapted to your particular area. So if you're using native plants, you have a better chance of being successful because they're used to the climate and the changes that occur in your particular area around weather. But as far as watering per se, you want to water deeply once per week until the roots are well established in your plants. When it comes to weeding, watering deeply once a week is also going to help you in terms of keeping your weeds down. You can also use mulch to reduce your weeds, and then of course you can do mechanical pulling, just basically physically getting in there and pulling out the weeds. You don't want to use herbicides, of course, for obvious reasons. Creating a habitat. So as we said earlier, providing a food source is very important, but with a little additional effort, you can provide some additional components and actually provide a habitat for these pollinators. Slide 17. So in terms of habitat components, providing food sources is certainly important, but you can also provide a sustainable habitat by adding a few additional elements. So suitable habitats require these following components. You have to have a food source, you have to provide water in some form, you have to have shelter, and you have to have a place to reproduce. So those are the four main components. In terms of food source, you have to understand how your pollinators function, what their natural history is, what their life cycle is. So while some pollinators feed primarily on nectar and pollen, in some species, the adult or the larva may have different dietary requirements depending on the age or the stage of their development. The adult, for example, may feed on nectar. The larva may actually feed on a host plant. So you need to understand that in terms of being able to provide food for the pollinators you want to attract. Water or moisture can be provided in a variety of ways. Something as simple as a bird bath helps provide water for your birds, but bees will visit that, butterflies will visit the edge of it and get moisture. Another option for butterflies is just to provide a moist spot of ground. So you can take a large bowl, fill it full of sand, put some pebbles on top of it, and saturate the sand with water. You don't want standing water, you just want the sand to be wet, and the butterflies will land on that and get the moisture they need. You can create the same sort of thing in the yard by just digging a small depression in the soil and replacing it with sand and doing the same thing. So providing water or some form of moisture is pretty easy to do. Shelter, as far as a habitat component, you can make that available in a variety of ways. You can use host plants. You can have just plant debris in the garden, stones, stumps, or logs, or you can provide man-made shelter. So shelter is another one that's pretty easy to accommodate in your garden. Places to reproduce, those can be provided by host plants, as I've mentioned before. So for example, milkweed is a primary host plant for monarch butterflies. By providing milkweed, you give a place for the butterfly to lay her eggs, and then when the eggs hatch, the larva can feed on the milkweed, and you've provided that place to reproduce. You've also provided shelter, and you've also provided a food source for that larva. Or you can provide physical structures. Honeybee hives, of course, are one that most people are familiar with. That's a man-made structure that provided by a beekeeper for the bees to have a place to live and also reproduce. Mason bee houses are becoming more popular over the past few years. These are structures that have a series of cardboard tubes inserted in them, or in some cases you'll see a block of wood that has rows of holes drilled in it. These provide a place for the female mason bee to deposit her eggs, and then she places pollen and nectar in with the egg and seals it up into a chamber. The egg hatches, the larva feeds on the pollen and nectar, it pupates and transforms into an adult bee, and then chews its way through the sealed chamber and exits the mason bee house. So there are lots of different ways to provide areas for reproduction for these pollinators as well. Well, this concludes my presentation. I want to thank you for your interest in supporting pollinators. Many pollinators are suffering from a lack of food and source and habitats. If everyone can plant even a small area together, we can provide a significant contribution to sustaining these important insects and other creatures. What follows, this slide is a resource section. It has information on organization, businesses, print and online references that you can use to get more information about specific questions. So for example, the Xerxes Society has a great website. You can go there and look up your region of the United States and get suggestions for plants that do well in that particular area. So there's a wealth of information in this reference section, so I hope you'll take advantage of that. I'd like to thank you again for your time and interest, and good luck with your pollinator garden. Thank you.